So please, in addition to listening to this lecture, make sure that you're doing your own reading and paying close attention to all those details in the chapter that we might not go over in this lecture. Okay, so chapter 1 starts off talking about one of the reasons that we communicate is to express a need or to fulfill a need. This is a diagram of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is a pretty basic theory or model in child development, family studies that you might have seen before. If this looks familiar, you might come across this in other classes. This is kind of a diagram of kind of what human beings need. This is Maslow's hierarchy. So the most basic being at the bottom, and then the most advanced needs or most abstract are going to be there at the top. So at the bottom, we would need the basic physical survival things before we can move on to the next level. And that's the premise behind this, is that we need to have the basic needs met before we can move on to the next level. So, for example, in a child development type of aspect, we might realize that kids in school, for example, can't really focus on learning and working on grades or assignments if they're not getting the proper nutrition that they need. So this diagram, kind of look over this, and you can see that belonging and social needs is right there in the middle. That's things like friendship and family relationships, things like that. And then all the way at the top is self-actualization, which is kind of like your full potential. Those are the highest types of needs. So something like charity work or developing talents, things like that, is going to be in the self-actualization category. Then we move on to the communication models. So early in the study of communication, there was the linear model. These are kind of the most basic, just very first theories about communication. And these linear models were just a one-way street. There's one person sending a message, one person receiving a message. It just goes one way. The receiver is not really participating. They're just kind of a passive listener. And then a little more advanced models later on would allow for the listener then to provide feedback. So it turned this one-way street into a two-way street, where one person was sending, the other person was receiving, and then giving feedback. And then the most advanced models are the transactional. Now, the transactional model eliminates the idea of a sender and a receiver, and it says we just have communicators, and everyone's a communicator, whether you're talking or not. You're always communicating. And the transactional models also include things like the context, the relationship between the people, things like culture. Lots of different other factors are going to affect the communication. And then the textbook goes on to this idea of the communication continuum. And this is where we find those terms, the I, it, I, you, and I, thou. And basically what this is saying is there are 3 levels of communication types of relationships. In the very first one, the I, it, the person, one of the people in the communication doesn't even acknowledge the other person. An example of this might be if, say, a telemarketer calls you and you just immediately say, I'm not interested, and you hang up, and you don't even acknowledge that the other person exists, really. Then that middle one, the I, you, this is more of like just surface level communication that you might find in day-to-day life if you're talking to the waitress at the restaurant, or sometimes between coworkers. It's focused more on the roles that, like as your teacher or a student, things like that. So the people are acknowledging each other, but it's not a very deep kind of personal conversation. And then the final one, the I, thou, this would be something that's very personal information between best friends or people in a significant other type of relationship, where it goes much deeper into the personal information being exchanged. Okay, so then we talk about features of interpersonal communication. The first is that it's selective. That means people pick and choose who they're going to communicate with and who they're going to share information with. Systemic, and that's kind of what we were talking about before with those transactional models, is that everything in the system affects the communication. So things like culture, environment, the relationship status, things like that. And we're going to talk about noise, which is part of the system on the next slide. It's individual. That means each person is unique and they communicate in their own unique way. It's a process that evolves over time. So the first time you talk to someone is not going to be as deep or as meaningful as it is once you've known them for a longer time. Transactional is kind of the same thing as that model we were talking about before, the third model. And then personal knowledge being exchanged. Again, that's sort of like the I-thou idea of the more that you get to know people, the more personal information that you're going to feel comfortable exchanging. Meaning creating is, I like to think of it as like the inside joke type of situation where as you get to know someone, you start to share meaning. So you'll find symbols that make sense to each other, words that click, and you say, oh, remember when we did that? So an inside joke where people might not, outsiders might not understand what you're talking about, but the two people having the conversation are just cracking up because it reminds them of something funny that happened a while ago. So meaning creating is there's special symbolism or special meaning of things that is unique to that relationship. Okay, so with that systemic feature, we were talking about noise, and there's a few different kinds of noise. And noise is anything that really distracts from the conversation or can be an interference in a communication. So physiological is anything having to do with your body. So say you're so hungry and you can't concentrate on what the other person's saying, or you have a pounding headache and it's making it difficult for you to have a conversation, or you're really tired or something like that. And then physical, I know this sounds kind of like what physiological should be, but physical is anything in the environment. So this would be like actual noise. So if something's really loud and then you can't hear the other person, or maybe it's really dark in the room so you can't see their facial expressions. So this is something from the environment that's actually causing a disruption in the communication. And then psychological is maybe something that you're thinking about that's causing you to be distracted. So, I was focused so much on taking my test tomorrow that I wasn't paying attention to what my friend was saying because I was so worried about something in my mind. And then semantic, this would be things like a language barrier. This is something actually having to do with the words that are being spoken. So maybe it's someone's second language and you're having a hard time understanding them, or the example they use in the textbook is that sometimes professors will use these really big words and the students don't understand, and that causes a disruption in the communication. So with the noise, just make sure you're understanding the difference between the physiological and the physical, because those can kind of get confusing of which is which. So make sure to take a look at that in the textbook. Okay, so before we were talking about features, and now we move on to principles. And these are kind of just some basic ideas about communication. So we cannot not communicate. We're always communicating, even if we're not speaking. The silence is communicating something, things like body language and things like that. It's irreversible. So obviously, you can't unhear something that someone says to you. So even if someone apologizes or says, oh, I didn't mean it, it's sort of like you can accept their apology, but you always have that memory of, oh, yeah, they said that. And so it's irreversible. Ethical choices. You can have issues where right and wrong is in consideration. That's what ethical, just, should I lie to my boss? Or should I tell that secret that my best friend asked me not to share? Things like that. Just the difference between right and wrong, and communication will sometimes have those kinds of decisions. And then people construct meaning. That's kind of what we were talking about before with the meaning creating idea of symbols, words, stories, things that have a special meaning to you that other people might not understand. Metacommunication, this is the idea that you're communicating about your communication. So meta just means about something. So if I'm talking about our communication, so for example, I might say like, we had such a good talk last night. So I'm referencing a communication that we had, and I'm talking about it. So you're kind of analyzing your communication. That would be meta communication. And that it develops and sustains relationships. So this is really how we grow closer to people, and communication is a really integral part of any type of relationship. Communication is not a panacea. That word panacea is kind of a little weird. So it's just, that word would mean a cure-all. So communication is not a cure-all. I think a lot of people will say, oh, we just need better communication and that would fix our marriage, or, I just need to communicate better with my mom and then our relationship would be great. So the idea behind this principle is that communication is great and it does develop and sustain relationships, but it doesn't fix everything. It's not the easy answer, not the cure-all for all your problems. And learning how to be effective at communication can be a learned skill.